Welcome back to another installment of Julian's Random Projects. I'm typically just a Mac person, so I've got OS X running on most computers in the house, but I had access to a quote-unquote gaming laptop recently, and I stumbled across Grand Theft Auto V and enjoyed it thoroughly. And at some point I had to give that laptop back. So I thought I'd quickly take you along the journey that is breathing new life into an old PC. If this thing was like a dual core or a Core Duo or an i5 or something, we would have been off to the races and add a big graphics card or something like that. But my goal was do it on the cheap as possible, and so I started looking around the house to see what I had. But surprisingly, let's get this thing opened up for you here. Surprisingly, I discovered that processor was an i7. And despite the fact that it's running Windows Vista of all things, it's a pretty capable computer. i7's top of the line. Of course, there's lots of variations of the i7, of course, but I was pleased to find that. So step number one is to figure out why was it taken out of commission in this case. And it became pretty obvious when I booted it up the first time. It got really, really hot. I'm guessing it hit proc hot, which is short for processor hot. And the system will shut itself down when it sees that. And it is because of this culprit. It was a thin layer of dust, or, let's just call it dust, that had formed on this heatsink. And this happens a lot when people put their computers down on the floor, especially if they have carpet or kids that are running around kicking stuff up, or animals and pets. So that is the reason this particular computer fell out of use. It's a quick enough fix. It's a lot of blowing it out, or in my case I ended up washing it and reinstalling it. Then I blew out all of the dust and dirt, added in an inexpensive USB 3 card. These run about 16 to 20 bucks, or about $15 in this case. And if you're wondering what this is, I mentioned a previous project, or a previous post. So I used this keyboard and display to bootstrap that guy before I ended up connecting the full-on display and keyboard. So after cleaning it up and installing the USB 3 card, we add a Wi-Fi dongle, an inexpensive 120 gig SSD card, a lot faster than the original hard drive that was in here. And typically I would say peg out the memory, or memory up to some reasonable amount, like 8 or 16 gigabytes, depending on what you're trying to do with the system. And in this case, I'm interested in playing Grand Theft Auto again. And so 8 to 16 gigs would be pretty nice. This particular motherboard doesn't support 16 gigs. It'll only do 12. I ordered the max config from eBay. This lot would have cost me about 20 bucks had they sent me the right kind. They sent me PC2. This thing needed PC3. But the logic still stands. If you find a good deal on eBay for some RAM that somebody doesn't want, and find it in maybe configurations that are less desirable, like 4 sticks of 4 gigabytes or something. So people are usually trying to sell a chunk of them that have come out of some old PC that they're upgrading. Buy the whole chunk and you get a pretty decent deal on those. It came with this graphics card, which ended up being pretty old and long in the tooth, not supported by any modern games. Luckily, I had an old, a couple years old, a GT640 from NVIDIA. Not a crazy aggressive graphics card, but it was free. It was just kicking around. It came out of some other PC build I'd done in the past. It was like included with the computer, but I was yanking it out and putting in a proper graphics card. But it's almost like the little graphics card that could, as you'll see later when we get this thing fired up. So with no door on here, as we've got it here is set up for testing, you're going to need some way of cooling off these chipsets and memory sticks and things. They've got their own little heat sinks, but they
rely on the door being here for this fan to pull air through the case and out. Without that, you need to push some air, and so I've just sort of rigged up this case fan I've got laying around. Then finally boot it up. It had Windows Vista on it. I blew that away and installed Windows 7 on it. Once Windows 7 booted up, they were kind enough to remind me that there's a free Windows 10 upgrade, and I took it. It was a bit of a pain in the dick to get installed, failed a few times, then for some reason it didn't like my product key for Windows 7, and then finally made it through. I installed the drivers for the GT640 from NVIDIA, and lastly, fired up a few different benchmark tests. Played around with overclocking the GT640, which improved frame rate a little bit in its frames per second. Started hitting like solid 40s. And I decided that was probably about as much as I was ever going to get out of an old graphics card. I was actually kind of pleased as punch that I got to play with overclocking for the first time. Then waited forever for the 60 gigabytes to download from Steam for Grand Theft Auto 5 and got it fired up. Under 1080p, I'm getting about 30 frames per second, which is pretty respectable for an almost free computer. And if you tweak some of the settings and fiddle with things, you can get into the 60s. But it's a pretty rough looking game at 60 frames per second, so I'm going to probably dial it back to 30 frames per second. Or in this case, dial it up to 30 frames per second. At least dial up all the different textures and graphical enhancements, and then take the hit in frame rate. So there you have it, a pretty cheap and capable little PC. And granted, I really lucked out getting an i7 for free from a friend. That's probably not going to happen to everybody, but I think you'd have really similar results if you got one from like a recycling center or a place that refurbishes old computers, buying like an older i5 and then pegging out its memory. And there's also things you can do with the BIOS. If you look around in Google, you can find alternative BIOSes for OEM motherboards, which is the next step for this because I'm interested in overclocking it and water cooling. And if that water cooling and overclocking of the CPU goes well, the next logical step is to put something like this bad boy in there. The GeForce GTX 980 Ti. Which, without doubling these up in some sort of SLI configuration, is about the biggest bang for your buck you're going to get on a gaming PC. And I think that this little tower would do real well with it. Well, time will tell what type of performance and frames per second we can get out of a card like this and a system like that. And if you're interested in seeing how it goes, subscribe and stay tuned.